So in this PowerPoint, we're going to discuss basically the brain and the spinal cord, but mostly the brain, and then we're going to talk about a few disorders of the brain and the spinal cord. So there are four major areas of the brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. So this is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It involves conscious thought processes and intellectual functions. It's responsible for memory, storage, and processing, and it's also responsible for the regulation of both conscious and subconscious skeletal muscle contractions. This is the diencephalon, which consists of two main regions, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus relays and processes sensory information, and what I mean by that is sensory information comes in from skin and muscle from all over your body and comes up the spinal cord. And when it hits the thalamus will direct those sensations to the appropriate part of the brain so that the brain is properly able to process this information. So let's say that you stub your toe. The thalamus is the part of the brain that gets that sensation to the part of your brain that's concerned with perceiving what's going on with your big toe. So if the thalamus was having some sort of dysfunction, if it was sending things in the wrong direction, you might stub your toe but perceive it as paining your finger. The hypothalamus has a lot of different functions, especially for something as small as it is. It controls emotions. It has autonomic functions, and that means that it controls a lot of things like the endocrine system, hormone production. It also sets your body temperature, and it's also involved in directing other parts of the brain in controlling things like respiration rate and heart rate. This is the cerebellum. It coordinates complex motor patterns. This is somatic motor patterns. And what it means by that, this is skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle. And so your brain basically, your cerebrum basically initiates movement, but it's your cerebellum that actually fine-tunes it. So it says that adjusts the output of other somatic motor centers in the brain and spinal cord. So basically what the cerebellum is it's sort of a coordination center that makes sure that your movements are smooth and coordinated. These are the three parts of the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and we'll get into those a little bit later. So the cerebrum is the largest portion of the human brain, and it's the last center to receive sensory input. So even though it's the boss, basically, it receives sensory input last, but it does carry out integration before it decides on voluntary motor responses. So there are two hemispheres to the cerebrum, left and right, and they're divided by what's called the longitudinal fissure. And if you look at the diagram on the top, at the picture on the top, you'll see this deep division between the two hemispheres. That's the longitudinal fissure. It's covered by gray matter, as you can see in the top picture as well. And there are four main lobes, and these lobes are basically named after the bones of the skull that they're underneath. So that's going to be the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And hopefully, after your lab test on the skeleton, this is something that will be familiar to you. So the cerebrum contains what are called association areas, and this is where integration occurs and memories are stored. So basically what these association areas are going to do is identify the data that are coming in. For instance, your visual area would allow you to see something, the visual area of your brain, but the visual association area is going to allow you to identify what it is that you're seeing. And it's able to do that because these association areas store memories. So the premotor area, this organizes functions for motor activities like walking and talking at the same time. The somatosensory association, this processes information that's coming in from the skin and the muscles. So body position, things like pain, things like pressure, touch, heat, all of these things are going to be processed by the somatosensory association area. The visual association area, this associates new information with previously received information. So when you see something, the visual association area says, oh yes, that's a lamp, or that's a glass, or that's a remote control, or that's by phone. So this is going to associate the new information that's coming in, what you're just now seeing, with information that you've received in the past. The auditory association, this performs the same thing with regard to sounds. So if there's a song that you particularly like, or a song that you particularly hate, if you're hearing it again, then it's your auditory association area that's going to identify that song as the one that you like or that you dislike. Okay, processing centers receive information from all of these different association areas and they analyze it. And so the prefrontal area in particular uses information to reason and plan actions, so to think critically and formulate proper behaviors. Wernicke's area helps you understand both written and spoken words. So if, let's say that Wernicke's area um, is damaged during an accident or a stroke. So let me kind of set the scene for you. I had a friend in grad school from Ethiopia, and he had a lot of family in the Atlanta area. So I would go visit him when they were having some sort of big function. Let's say like when his first daughter was christened. That's a good example. And so there were like 40 people in this house, and every single one of them is speaking Ethiopian. And there were 2 or 3 people who could speak decent English, but you know, there were basically like 37 or 38 Ethiopians, a couple of American spouses who could speak the language, and me. So of course everybody's speaking in Ethiopian. And so there'd be all these conversations going on around me, and I couldn't understand a single word of it. If your Wernicke's area was damaged, then people could be speaking in English all around you, and you would have no idea what they were saying. You wouldn't be able to understand a single word. You also might not be able to read it at all. It might look completely foreign to you as well. Broca's area is what directs motor actions for speech. So if you're thinking something and you're trying to actually get the words out, it's Broca's area that coordinates things and allows you to speak. So it allows you to interpret, it allows you to take thought and translate it into speech. So this is an area that's pretty frequently damaged in a lot of strokes. And so a lot of the time stroke patients have trouble recovering the ability to speak, and it's because their Broca's area has been damaged. So the diencephalon is composed of the hypothalamus and the thalamus. And as I said, the hypothalamus, it's an integrating center that helps in homeostasis. So this helps regulate, I think I mentioned this before, body temperature, but also water balance. It's responsible for making you hungry and thirsty, and it's also responsible for at least partially regulating sleep. It also controls the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is known as the master gland of the endocrine system. The pituitary gland basically controls every other major endocrine gland in the body. And so the hypothalamus controls that, and that makes this your link between the nervous and the endocrine systems. The thalamus is a sensory relay center, as I mentioned before, and there's an analogy that I usually give for this, and it definitely is something that I'm not sure you guys are familiar with. If you've ever seen old movies where there's a telephone switchboard where operators are routing calls to the correct places, the thalamus is basically like the switchboard of the brain. It's a sensory relay center. And so it receives all sensory input except for smell, and it sends it to the appropriate areas in the cerebrum. So basically, if you see something, before that sensation gets to the visual area or the visual association area, either one of those, it passes through the thalamus, and the thalamus routes it to the appropriate area in the cerebrum. Now, this is also involved in the arousal of the cerebrum, and that basically means waking up. And it also participates in some higher mental functions like memory and emotional responses. The pineal gland is located, and some people call this the pineal gland. It's located in the thalamus and secretes melatonin, which you may have heard of. So a lot of people take melatonin as a sleep aid, and one of the reasons why is because melatonin regulates the normal sleep-wake cycle. And if someone has abnormal amounts of melatonin, they can have sleep disorders from that. Okay, so this is the area of the diencephalon. The cerebellum receives inputs, sensory input from joints, muscles about the position of body parts. So this is a sensation that's called proprioception. And what I'd like you to do right now real quick is close your eyes and touch your nose with your right index finger as your eyes are closed. Can you do that? Okay, so the fact that you could find your nose with your finger, with your eyes closed, tells you that you have sort of this sense of where your body position is, your sense of where your limbs are, the sense of where your muscles are. And that's the kind of data that the cerebellum actually receives, and that allows you to make a smooth movement and touch your finger to your nose instead of poking yourself in the eye or the ear. It receives motor output from the cerebral cortex about where those parts should be. So the cerebellum can kind of correct things that might be going wrong with motions. So what it does is to integrate the information about where the body parts are and information from the cerebral cortex about where they should be, and sends impulses to skeletal muscles that corrects them if they're not in the right place. So this gives us smooth movements, it gives us coordinated movements, voluntary muscle movements, that is, and it also helps us maintain posture. So there's the cerebellum on the right. The brainstem contains the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So basically, the midbrain it's a relay center for tracts, and remember that these are things that are like nerves, except they're in the spinal cord, for tracts that pass between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So basically, this is sort of a way station for communication between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It's also got reflex centers for visual and auditory and tactile responses. So the midbrain is responsible for something that I call reflexive head turning. And so if we were in class, what I would probably do is make a loud noise, and your head would turn towards me reflexively, and that's basically what the midbrain is responsible for. So if you turn your head towards a sudden bright light or a sudden movement or a sudden loud sound, then it's the midbrain that has that head turning reflex. So the pons contains axons that travel between the cerebellum and the rest of the central nervous system. So all of this input that's coming into the cerebellum about body position from all of your skeletal muscles is going to pass through the pons. The pons also regulates breathing rate along with the medulla oblongata. So here's, maybe my favorite part of the brain. It's because of the water boy clip that I showed you in a previous episode. So the medulla oblongata is responsible for regulating functions like heartbeat and breathing and blood pressure. It's also going to contain reflex centers for swallowing, coughing, vomiting, sneezing, and hiccuping. Those things that make life worth living. The medulla oblongata is also part of what's called the reticular activating system, and this is what arouses the cerebrum, causing alertness. So basically, the medulla contains reticular information that it sends up to higher centers and motor signals that it sends to the spinal cord. So let's say that you've been awoken by a sharp clap of thunder and lightning. So if you've ever been woken up like that, I've been woken up during thunderstorms and woken up like 6 inches off the bed and been instantly alert, and that's what happens. It's the reticular activating system that causes this alertness. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the limbic system and higher mental functions. So the limbic system associates emotions and higher mental functions. So basically it blends emotions and things like reason and memory into one basic reaction. So if you remember doing something and you're happy about it, it's the limbic system that does that. If you are anticipating doing something and you're mad about it, then it's the limbic system that's going to blend this memory and reason along with emotions. So this is why some activities can be associated as being pleasurable or stressful, and this is also why mental stress can cause high blood pressure, because the mental stress is blended by the limbic system into part of your body's response to stress, and high blood pressure can be a result of that. So these are the parts of the limbic system: the hippocampus, which communicates with the prefrontal area of the brain. And so if you recall, the prefrontal area of the brain is responsible for things like higher order thinking. And basically, before I go on to the amygdala, the hippocampus plays a large role in memory. Now, the amygdala is what allows us to respond to anger and display anger, avoidance, defensiveness, and fear, and it promotes the release of adrenaline, which is definitely associated with all of these different things. And so, if you recall that scene in Waterboy where the professor's saying, Can y'all tell me what's responsible for anger, fear, jealousy, and aggression? And they say the medulla oblongata. They're wrong. It would actually be the amygdala. And um, so I guess medulla oblongata sounded a little bit funnier, but it's actually the amygdala that does that. So there must be something wrong with his amygdala would have been the appropriate line in the movie. So the cerebrum is responsible for higher mental functions, and by these I mean memory and learning. So memory is basically your ability to recall some sort of information from the past, and it can be words, experiences, anything from really simple things to really complex things. And learning is the ability to apply those past memories as a guide for actions or behavior. The human cerebrum is also responsible for language and speech. So the different types of memory are short-term memory, and this is retained for basically a really short period. An example might be a phone number that you remember for just a minute and then forget it. And it depends on the prefrontal area being active. The long-term memory is retained for long periods, sometimes for life, and it's a mixture of what's called semantic memory, which is ideas, concepts, meanings like words and numbers, and episodic memory of events or facts or people. Now there's this kind of strange thing called there's basically a storage buffer that where short-term memory is stored, and sometimes it goes to long-term memory and sometimes it doesn't. And really the best way to get things into long-term memory is in a couple of different ways. One is by repetition, and the other is by really associating it with something that's already in long-term memory. So one of the reasons why I repeat things to y'all, that's one of the reasons I'm trying to get some of these things fixed in your long-term memory. But also one of the reasons why I use analogies and examples is to try to connect something that you've experienced in the past with something that you're learning in this class, and hopefully that will make things easier to get them into long-term memory for you and easier for you to remember them on the test. Okay, so the left and right cerebral hemispheres actually have got different functions related to language and speech. So the Broca's and Wernicke's areas are only in the left hemisphere. And so the Broca's, we talked about that earlier, it gives you basically the ability to speak, and Wernicke's basically gives you the ability to comprehend speech. Both hemispheres do process information, but they do it differently. The left hemisphere tends to be verbal, logical, rational. The right hemisphere tends to be nonverbal, intuitive, creative. And so there are people who feel like handedness is an indication of which hemisphere is dominant. And so if you're right-handed, you're supposed to be more verbal, logical, rational. If you're left-handed, a more intuitive and creative. And although as a left-handed person, I like the idea of being more intuitive and creative than you poor right-handed suckers out there. It's not a universal thing, so these are basically just tendencies. So there are plenty of people who are left-handed or right brain dominant who are very logical and rational, and plenty of people who are right-handed, who can be very intuitive and creative. So you're not locked into uh, thought patterns by which hemisphere is dominant. Okay, so here are just some of the parts of the brain that we've been talking about, some of the parts of the cerebrum that we've been talking about. So this is where Broca's area is located. This is the primary motor area. This is Wernicke's area. This is where the primary visual area is. And now this messes with a lot of people because, you think your eyes are at the front. Surely the visual area would be at the front of the brain, but your primary visual area is actually in the occipital lobe, and so is the auditory association area. So the weird thing is, if you received a sharp blow to the back of the head and really damaged your primary visual area, then you could have perfectly working eyes. You could have a perfectly working optic nerve that sends all of what your eyes perceive to the brain. And if the primary visual area isn't working, then basically you're blind. So a blow to the back of the head can blind you. Weird but true. This is the primary auditory area, and it is located where you would think it would be, the temporal lobe, which is right beside the ears. Okay, so let's talk about the peripheral nervous system. There are some things that I want to mention here. First of all, nerves are bundles of axons, and you're looking basically at an entire nerve here. Second thing is that nerve fibers are individual axons, and that's what you see projecting out on the right. It is an individual axon. So this is a nerve fiber, and so there's a single nerve fiber, and there's a bundle of nerve fibers right there. So once you take a single axon and you bundle it in with a lot of other axons, basically you've got a nerve. Ganglia are swellings that are associated with nerves, and we're going to wait on that one. Um, I'm going to show you that a little bit later in this PowerPoint. Okay, so another part of the peripheral nervous system, even though these nerves have a direct connection to the brain, they're still considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. And so there are 12 cranial nerves that are actually attached to the brain, and you see them on the right. So some of them are purely sensory. So a good example of this would be cranial nerve number 2, which is called the optic nerve. This comes from the retina of the eyes. So there's absolutely no movement that's associated with this. This is strictly sensory information that's coming in from the eyes. Now the oculomotor, which is nerve number 3, is a strictly motor nerve. So it has nothing to do with vision. It has everything to do with moving the eyeballs around in the socket. Same thing goes for the trochlear, which is cranial nerve number 4. Now some of them are mixed, both sensory and motor. I think a really good example of this would be a cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve. So it receives input from taste buds, but it also sends impulses to facial muscles and glands. So basically, this nerve can carry taste information in and directions to salivate out at the same time. So the cranial nerves are mainly concerned with the head, neck, and face, just about every single one of them, except for the vagus nerve, which is right here. You'll see the color highlighting. So that's cranial nerve number 10, which goes to and from internal organs. So basically, the vagus nerve helps to regulate a lot of things like heart rate, blood pressure, sweating, digestion, and even speaking. So basically, when you're digesting food, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Okay, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come from openings in the vertebral column between vertebrae. So basically, there are these openings called intervertebral foramina that are made up of sort of a hollow in one vertebra and a hollow in the vertebra that's just below it, so that the two together make sort of a little hole, and that's where the spinal nerves come out of. So each spinal nerve originates when you have two short branches of roots joining together. We'll see that on a diagram in just a minute. All spinal nerves are mixed nerves. So there were some cranial nerves that were strictly sensory, some that were strictly motor. Unlike those, the spinal nerves, every single one of them is a mixed nerve. So every single spinal nerve carries sensory information in and also carries motor information out. So the cell bodies of sensory neurons are located in dorsal root ganglia. This is the thing that I told you that I would talk to you about in just a minute. A ganglion is a swelling in a nerve, and that's where a lot of cell bodies are located. So if you recall from the last PowerPoint, the different parts of the neuron, the cell body was that largest portion that contains the nucleus and all of the other organelles. And so where those cluster, they cause a swelling in the nerve, and a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. And we'll see that dorsal root ganglion in just a moment on a diagram. Ventral roots contain the axons of motor neurons. So basically you can think of the dorsal side of a spinal nerve being sensory and the ventral side of a spinal nerve being motor. So let's take a look at this diagram here. So let me just point some things out. This is a ventral root. Now the ventral root is going to contain motor neurons for both somatic neurons and autonomic neurons. So basically both somatic and autonomic. So the somatic motor neurons are directing voluntary movement of your skeletal muscles. The autonomic neuron is also directing movement, but it'll direct movement of things like peristalsis or movement in the digestive tracts. So this is going to direct the action of smooth muscles and glandular tissue. So that's the ventral root. This is the dorsal root, and this is where sensory information actually comes in. So that green line there is supposed to represent one axon of one sensory neuron. And so hopefully now you can see where this swelling is. This is the dorsal root ganglion, and that dot that's at the point of the arrow is actually the cell body of a sensory neuron. If you look back at the somatic and the autonomic neurons on the bottom with the ventral root, you'll notice that they have dots at their very beginning, and that's because they're a differently shaped kind of neuron, and those cell bodies are actually located within the spinal cord itself. So when those two join, that's where you go to spinal nerve. So right there. And the spinal nerve will then proceed out, and it'll also proceed to do a whole lot of branching before it gets to a lot of different targets. Okay, so those were the dorsal roots, the dorsal root ganglia, and the ventral roots. All right, now the peripheral nervous system, we're going to continue talking about that. This is divided into the somatic system and the autonomic system. And basically the somatic system is, again, pretty much skeletal muscles and skin, and the autonomic system basically governs viscera, so internal organs, and smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So they direct different things. So the somatic system, like I said, serves the skin, skeletal muscles, and also tendons. So it includes nerves that carry both sensory information, and it includes nerves that carry motor information. So sensation from the skin, skeletal muscles, and tendons, and instructions that go to the skeletal muscles and tendons come from the somatic system. So it carries, again, motor commands away from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles. So some of the actions of the skeletal muscles are due to reflex actions, and we'll go over what a reflex arc is in just a little bit. So these are automatic responses to a stimulus. So not all movements of the skeletal muscles are actually voluntary. They're mostly voluntary, but not all of them are. So a reflex is something that occurs without you having to think about it. So let's say you set your hand down on something hot and then jerk your arm away. You're not really thinking about it. So I'm going to explain the reason why for this in just a moment. Okay, some of the actions of the somatic system are voluntary. So let's take a look at a reflex arc. This is a nerve pathway that carries out a reflex. So basically they're programmed, they're built in, you don't have to think about it, they're hardwired in. They allow for protection and survival. So I mentioned jerking your hand away from a hot surface. So basically the reason why reflexes exist is because reflexes come in basically chains of usually 3 neurons. So a sensory neuron that carries information to the spinal cord, an interneuron which is part of the spinal cord that gives directions to a motor neuron which comes straight back out of the spinal cord to whatever effector, probably a muscle, that makes you respond to this reflex. So if you've ever put your hand down on something hot and you jerked your hand away, and it felt like you jerked your hand away almost before you really felt the sensation. So you don't say ouch and then jerk your hand away. You jerk your hand away and then say ouch. At least I hope you say ouch instead of something more blue. Anyway, so the reason why you perceive the sensation after the reflex happens is there are 3 neurons that are involved in getting a reflex from the perception to the motion. Now, the pathway that it takes to your brain is one neuron gets the sensation to the spinal cord. Now that neuron will split in 2, and one split goes to the interneuron which directs the reflex arc. But the second branch of that neuron will connect with neuron number 2. So neuron number 2 goes up to the thalamus. The thalamus sends neuron number 3 to the somatosensory cortex, which basically says, oh wow, pain in the hand. So the somatosensory cortex sends a message to the motor cortex that says, hey, do something about this. The motor cortex says, fine, let's move the hand, but the spinal cord has already beat you to it. So it takes 3 neurons to get up to the brain. It takes another neuron, neuron number 4, to get from the somatosensory area to the motor cortex. It takes 2 neurons to get from the motor cortex back down to your effector. So that's basically going to be 6 neurons if your brain was in charge of jerking your hand away from the hot spot. So the reflex arc is a shortcut. It basically cuts the number of neurons that you need for this response in half, and it makes your response more quick. And so why would it be handy to have a quicker response? I want you to think about um, what could happen in an injury before modern medicine. So let's say that it's the 1300s and you burn your hand on a campfire and you don't get your hand jerked away fast enough. That could be the difference between a second degree burn and a third degree burn. So second degree burn doesn't break the skin. You've still got the protection of the skin there. A third degree burn breaks the skin. And so that's a route in for infections. And so if you get a third degree burn on your hand, maybe your hand gets infected. And, if you're living in the 1500s, you might have to lose the hand, or you might have to lose the arm, or if you don't want to do that, you might lose your life from that one infection. So reflex actions can make the difference between a life-threatening injury and one that's not life-threatening. Okay, and this is because they enable the body to react swiftly to some sort of stimulus. They don't require conscious control. Like I said, this is a complete bypass of your brain. It's your spinal cord that's in charge of what's going on. So I've had students ask me, can somebody be brain dead and still have these reflexes? The answer to that is yes. You can elicit like a knee-jerk reflex on someone who's brain dead because it's not the brain that's involved in that reflex. It's the spinal cord that runs it. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a somatic reflex arc here. And so the first thing that I want us to do is get oriented. So here's the dorsal side of the spinal cord, and here's the ventral side of the spinal cord. So remember that dorsal is sort of the back of the spinal cord, and ventral is sort of the front of the spinal cord. Okay, this is the central canal, and cerebrospinal fluid runs through here. Here's white matter. And so white matter is composed of axons, myelinated axons. So whenever you're looking at white matter, you're looking at lines of communication. So you might be looking at something like cable lines right here. This is gray matter. And in gray matter, you're going to find cell bodies. And you're also going to find dendrites, which don't have myelin. But you'll also find some neuron axons that also don't have myelin on them, but they tend to be very, very short neurons. So gray matter is going to contain all different parts of neurons. White matter is only going to contain axons. Now the gray matter in the spinal cord can be divided up into, on each side, two general areas. One is called the dorsal horn, and one is called the ventral horn. And so to me, this looks kind of like wings on a butterfly. So the top wings would be the dorsal horn, and the bottom wings would be the ventral horn. So now let's take a look at the route of a somatic reflex arc. So let's say that you have a pin causing an injury and your sensory receptor in the skin picks it up. What's going to happen? It's going to send a signal in this direction along the axon of the sensory neuron. Along the way, it's going to bypass the dorsal root ganglion, and it's also going to bypass the cell body of this sensory neuron. So it's just going to stay on that axon, and it'll make its way up to the spinal cord. When it gets to the spinal cord, there will be a synapse and communication between the sensory neuron and the interneuron. So what it's going to do is it's going to pass a nerve impulse to the interneuron. What the interneuron is going to do is it's going to send a nerve impulse to a motor neuron, and the motor neuron will send its impulse down through the ventral root, down the axon of the motor neuron in this direction back to the effector or muscle. So you can see here that there are three neurons that are involved: sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. Bang, bang, bang. So this is about as quick a response as you can get. So one thing that this diagram doesn't show is that the interneuron, the sensory neuron will send a second branch of the axon to another interneuron that takes the signal to the brain instead of to the motor neuron. Okay, so now let's talk about the autonomic system. This is what regulates the activity of cardiac and smooth muscle and glands. So one thing that I want to say real quick about the autonomic system versus the somatic system is that the autonomic system and the somatic system actually have separate nervous system pathways. And so one of the reasons why they get so easily divided up is because there are literally different routes from the central nervous system to cardiac and smooth muscle and glands versus to the skeletal muscles. Now, there's two divisions of the autonomic system, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic division is basically fight or flight, and it's important during emergency situations. Now, I do want to say this, though. A lot of people think of the sympathetic division as fight or flight only, but there are a lot of non-emergency situations where you're going to need the sympathetic division kicking in and increasing its activity. So a good example of sympathetic division activity is regulation of the heartbeat. So the sympathetic division, as you know, if you get a big adrenaline rush, then your heart rate will speed up. But if you're exercising, if you're not in any kind of panic or you're not angry, you're just exercising, you're still going to need your heart rate to speed up. And so in this case, the sympathetic division will also increase its activity for that non-emergency function. So it increases heart rate and contractility. It will dilate or open up the bronchial tubes. And I want you to think about this. If you're on a treadmill, you're going to need an increased heart rate, but you're also going to need the bronchi to expand in order to get oxygen into the lungs faster. Also, it will inhibit the digestive tract. So you may have noticed that right after a workout or right after intense activity, you don't have much of an appetite. That tends to kick in a little bit later. And the reason why is because it takes a little while for the effects of the sympathetic division to wear off. So at least for a little while, exercise can be a little bit of an appetite suppressant. Okay, so the sympathetic division also causes the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine is what you would know as commonly as adrenaline. And so adrenaline and norepinephrine, these increase blood pressure that cause the heart to beat stronger and faster, and they'll also constrict other blood vessels. And so where would the blood vessels be constricted? Actually, some blood vessels that are constricted are the coronary vessels, so the vessels that feed blood to the heart muscle. So I want you to think about this. If somebody has coronary arteries that are partially blocked and adrenaline causes those blood vessels to squeeze down further, this is why if somebody's coronary arteries are in bad shape already, if they get really angry or really scared or really upset, then those coronary arteries will completely shut off because of the blockages in them, and somebody has a heart attack. So the parasympathetic division comes from some nerves that come straight out of the brain, so some of the cranial nerves, and some fibers coming from the sacral part of the spinal cord. So you know where the sacrum is. It's that portion of the vertebra that's at the very bottom, those fused vertebrae. Okay, so if I can backtrack just a little bit, the sympathetic division comes out of the thoracic and some lumbar vertebrae. So nothing from the cervical area, just sort of trunk and abdomen, the vertebrae that are right there in that area. We'll see a diagram of that in just a minute. So thoracolumbar for sympathetic, craniosacral for parasympathetic. And basically the parasympathetic is kind of the opposite number of the sympathetic division. It does some housekeeping stuff like promoting all of your responses that are rest and digest. And so this will decrease your heart rate. This will promote food digestion. Now, there are a couple of examples that I give of both sympathetic and parasympathetic when they're in peak activity. So let's say it's a normal spring with no coronavirus, and you decide to go out hiking, maybe in Cades Cove or something. You're on a trail, you come around a bend in a trail, and there's a bear. And it's a skinny bear with 3 skinny cubs beside it, and it looks at you and drools. And you can tell that bear is looking at you, and it's not seeing you, it's seeing a big corn dog that it can chomp down and help feed to its cubs. So you know you're in trouble. And so what happens? Your heart starts going like crazy. Your respiration rate really increases. Your muscles contract faster and stronger. And the next thing you know, you are 20 feet up in a tree with your heart hammering like crazy, wondering how the heck you got up there. So fight or flight. And you chose flight because who's going to fight a bear, right? So that's kind of, to me, the sort of the apex of a sympathetic reaction. Now, parasympathetic is kind of just the opposite. So there's not any adrenaline involved here at all. So with the parasympathetic, let me set the scene for you. So let's say it's November, it's Thanksgiving, okay? It's Thanksgiving, and you've just had a great time with family, and you've eaten about 2.5 or 3 pounds of great food, maybe some of my mac and cheese, but you've had fantastic food, and you're stuffed to the gills, you're on the couch, and the Thanksgiving parade is on, and you know a bowl game or football game's not a bowl game, but you know a football game's getting ready to come on, and the remote is just out of reach, and your big conflict is, do I stretch a little bit to get to the remote, or do I just lay here and feel warm and fuzzy? And that's basically, to me, parasympathetic. So they say so the parasympathetic, its neurotransmitter of choice is not adrenaline. It is actually acetylcholine. And so there's some people that are adrenaline junkies that get, a big rush from doing dangerous things and, skydiving and all that kind of thing, and base jumping and, free rock climbing, adrenaline junkies. And I am an acetylcholine junkie because I'd rather be on the couch feeling warm and fuzzy than jacked up on adrenaline. Okay, so again, like I said, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Okay, so this, I'm not going to go over all the information in this. I just want to show you some examples of the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic. And I wanted to tell you that generally, in most cases, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions oppose one another. So if you look at the picture of the heart, you've got the sympathetic division fibers leading to the different organs from the left. You've got the parasympathetic fibers leading to the different organs from the right. So let's take a look at the heart and see what happens. So what does the sympathetic division do to the heart? Well, it's going to speed it up and make it beat more strongly. What's the parasympathetic division going to do? It's going to slow the heart. Now, one of the curious things that happens here is that although the parasympathetic can act to slow the heart, it can't slow down the intensity of the heart. So if you've ever gotten a really bad scare and your heart beats really hard and really fast, you'll notice that your heart slows down, but sometimes the beat stays intense for a while. It's because the parasympathetic division, while it can slow down the heart, it can't do anything to the force of the heartbeat. It's just going to have to slow down on its own. So the next thing that I want you to take a look at is actually take a look at that top yellow circle that's on the left, and below that you're going to see this. Oh, I'm sorry, look at the lungs. So the sympathetic division dilates air passages, and if you're looking at the lungs now, the parasympathetic will constrict bronchioles. So if you've ever heard of somebody having an allergic attack or an asthma attack, what is it that you give them? You're going to give them an EpiPen so that it'll open up their airways. And so the reason why you can give them an EpiPen is because it dilates air passages, and that keeps the person from having their bronchioles so constricted that they can't breathe. But one of the dangers of using an EpiPen, a large dose of it, would be that it could speed up the heart and put the heart under a lot of strain. So now let's take a look down at the intestines, and you can see that the sympathetic division will decrease intestinal activity, and you will see that the parasympathetic will increase intestinal activity. So these three examples have been opposed to one another, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. Now, take a look at the very bottom, and the reproductive system is actually one of the few cases where the sympathetic and the parasympathetic have to actually work together for the system to work correctly. So the parasympathetic will cause the erection of genitals, and the parasympathetic will cause the erection of the genitals, and the sympathetic will cause orgasmic contractions. So basically, in order for sexual intercourse to work, for men, there's got to be an erection and there's got to be an orgasm. And in this case, instead of the two systems opposing one another, then they have to work together for normal function. Okay, an electroencephalogram, this is what measures the electrical activity of the brain. So every single nerve impulse that happens is due to ions, and there's a current and there's electrical activity that can be measured. And so there's a recording produced of it. And so basically in an EEG, electrodes get taped to different parts of the scalp, and here's a picture of what the electrodes look like. Okay, And EEG can diagnose conditions like epilepsy or brain tumors because under those conditions, there can be an abnormal EEG. So you've probably heard of an EKG with the heart showing abnormal patterns sometimes. There are abnormal patterns that can show up with an EEG as well. Okay, so there are a lot of both legal and illegal drugs that can cause um, actions of a particular neurotransmitter at brain synapses. And so the first thing that I'm going to tell y'all is a personal disclaimer. Any of these things that are illegal, I am only speaking from book knowledge. I have not experienced them myself, and I would encourage you not to do any of those. In fact, even the legal ones that I'm going to talk about, alcohol and nicotine, aren't particularly good for you either. Um, so these drugs can cause can affect the actions of neurotransmitters. So stimulants will increase neuron activity, and depressants will decrease them. So the big one here, the big neurotransmitter here is dopamine. And so dopamine is kind of a feel-good neurotransmitter. So let me kind of give you an example that I think everyone can relate to. So there's probably a food that you've got that you just absolutely love. So you eat that food and you just get this warm feeling down your spine, and you're really happy for, 30 seconds. For me, that's key lime pie. If you give me a really good key lime pie, I'll take one bite of it and I just love the world for like 20 seconds. And so if you've got a food like that, you've experienced a little bit of a dopamine rush. And it's that rush that people get attuned to, and that's what makes people actually addicted. So dopamine is kind of the causation of a lot of addictive behaviors. So cocaine, for one thing, this will increase the effects of dopamine, and that's one of the reasons why people get hooked on it. So we're going to go over some different drugs. So nicotine, I think you know where that's found. Um, it causes a release of epinephrine, which can raise your blood sugar levels. But the problem is you get a crash afterwards, and depression and fatigue can set in. But in the central nervous system, nicotine can cause the release of dopamine, so people will get a little bit of a buzz from it, and they feel good from it. So this reinforcing effect will lead to drug dependence. And so nicotine has both a physiological and a psychological dependence. Alcohol influences an inhibitory neurotransmitter called GABA and other neurotransmitters called serotonin and dopamine. So there are some neurologists who would tell you if alcohol wasn't a poison, it would be a fantastic anesthetic, because what it does is to uh, affect this inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it does so in such a fashion that reduces pain. So this is the reason why people can get really drunk and hardly feel any pain at all. It's because their pain impulses that are coming into the central nervous system have been inhibited. Okay, alcohol gets metabolized in the liver, and this is where both short-term and long-term effects can be seen, because alcohol will prevent the liver from breaking down fats, and in fact it'll accumulate in the liver after only one night of drinking. This is your first stage of liver damage, and it's pretty easily reversible as long as you don't do this again. But if you continue to consume alcohol at a high level, it will cause fibrous scar tissue, and to a certain extent this is still reversible, but long-term consumption is going to cause cirrhosis, which is not reversible, and this is where you've had death of enough liver cells to cause either to lose partial or complete function of the liver. Okay, so cannabis sativa, marijuana, contains tetrahydrocannabinol, and so this is called THC, in other words. So there's a lot of stuff about cannabis oil that's out right now, and people are promoting it as the latest cure-all for everything. Um, to be honest with you, I'm a little surprised that no one has tried to push CBD oil as a cure for the coronavirus. So CBD oil is something that's completely different from tetrahydrocannabinol. It doesn't have any sort of effects on the central nervous system. It's just basically an oil. Okay, so THC, back to that, it binds to receptors for anandamine, which is a neurotransmitter, and what it'll do is it'll create a feeling of contentment, and that's the main thing that people are in it for. And it'll influence short-term memory processing, so people have trouble remembering what just happened if they're high on marijuana. So short-term use will give you mild euphoria. There's no doubt it alters judgment and coordination. But long-term use, heavy use will cause anxiety, paranoia, some psychotic symptoms, and long-term use can lead to permanent brain dysfunction, so brain impairment. Okay, heroin, it basically is derived from morphine, and this is basically an alkaloid of opium. And so what it does is to bind to natural endorphin receptors, and endorphins are chemicals that are basically like natural, if you can think of them as natural opiates. So they help reduce pain, and they'll also give you kind of a nice feeling. And so if you've ever gotten like um, an exercise high, that comes from endorphin receptors. And so what heroin does is it mimics the actions of endorphins. So it does produce euphoria, a pain relief, tranquil feeling. But the problem is, if you use it repeatedly, then the body will stop producing its own endorphins. And so there are a lot of chemicals that react this way, that if the body produces it naturally and you start getting it from an outside source, the body's going to be lazy and say, well, if I'm getting this from an outside source, I don't have to produce it anymore. So someone who gets hooked on heroin or any other opiate like that, so OxyContin, oxycodone, hydrocodone. So if somebody's been taking that for a long time, then their body's going to stop producing natural endorphins. Another thing that happens is that somebody can build up tolerance. That's something I should have also mentioned with alcohol, but somebody will also build up tolerance to opiates. And after you develop the tolerance, then you have to take more of the drug to prevent withdrawal symptoms. So this is the reason why people keep on accelerating their dosages of the drugs. And so the withdrawal symptoms are going to be perspiration, tremors, restlessness, cramps, dilated pupils, increased blood pressure, increased respiratory rate. So I will say that I had to be for an autoimmune reaction that caused me a lot of pain. I had to be on a fairly decent dose of oxycodone, and I apologize if that makes you feel uncomfortable, but I'm just trying to relate my personal experience to you. And so I got on a pretty high dosage, and I didn't get any of the. I felt kind of lucky about it because I didn't get any of the euphoria or the tranquil feeling. It just took some of the pain away. But when I had to come off of it, then I got all of these withdrawal symptoms. Even though it stepped it down over a period of weeks, it still can be a pretty rough thing to go through. So if you have an excess dependence, it can lead to convulsions, respiratory failure, and death. Okay, Alzheimer's disease is another disorder of the brain, and it's the most common cause of dementia. Early onset Alzheimer's disease can appear before age 50, but most of the time it happens to people who are more senior than that. So loss of memory of recent events is an early symptom, and my mom's mother, my grandmother, died of Alzheimer's disease. And I can tell you all this, the victims forget the most recent things first. So at a certain point in her disease progression, she'd forgotten that she had grandchildren. So we would go visit her. She was in a nursing home. We would go visit her, and she would be introduced to us all over again. And of course, it was really sad, but in one way, it's kind of cool because she would be overjoyed at the fact that she had grandchildren. What was really sad was the point at which she forgot my dad and forgot her own son-in-law, and then forgot who her daughter was. And so, um, if you think of the accumulation of memories as winding a ball of yarn, where the earliest memories are on the inside of the ball of yarn, and the later memories kind of wrap over it. Alzheimer's disease is like unspooling that ball of yarn, but a whole lot more quickly. So the earliest memories are the ones that go the last. So you have abnormal neurons in the hippocampus and the amygdala, and so the hippocampus, again, remember that that's associated with memory. And so you have two symptoms, plaques of a type of protein called beta amyloid, and what are called neurofibrillary tangles, which are fibers in the axons that tangle up and they inhibit nerve impulses, so the axons don't work the way that they should. There are several genes identified that predispose people to Alzheimer's disease, but I have to be honest, I think that at some point Alzheimer's disease will be categorized not as a disease but as a syndrome, something that can be caused by either environmental or genetic effects or combinations of the two. So there's no prevention or cure. If you're predisposed to it, if you have a genetic predisposition to it, if you're going to get it, you're going to get it. Once you've got it, it's not going away. Okay, and if you take a look at the top picture, you can see where there's the beta amyloid and it's forming a plaque, and that plaque can actually sit down on part of the neuron and inhibit the neuron from firing. Inside the axon, if you look at the bottom, then you've got these neurofibrillary tangles, and this happens when a protein called tau binds to microtubules, and basically there are some different effects of this. One of those is that neurotransmitters are actually manufactured in the cell body and migrate down microtubules to the axon terminals. And if the microtubules are off, if they're tangled, then you can't get these neurotransmitters down to the axon terminals, and these neurons cannot communicate with other neurons. So if this happens enough, then you start to lose entire networks, and you lose things like memories as a result of that. Okay, Parkinson's disease is usually characterized by a gradual loss of motor control, and it usually onsets between 50 and 60. Later on, you can have tremors, muscle rigidity, speaking can be different. You can also have emotional effects, and it can also have effects on memory. So basically, there is a group of neurons in something called the substantia nigra, and this is a group of sort of black colored neurons, and that's the reason for the name. And so this makes me have to introduce another term. So you remember that a ganglion was a collection of cell bodies that's in the peripheral nervous system. A nucleus is a collection of cell bodies that's in the central nervous system. So basal nuclei means that this is a cluster of cell bodies that are found in the brainstem, or sort of the base of the brain. So these neurons produce dopamine, and I refer to that as kind of your feel-good neurotransmitter, but it's also got a lot of important regulatory effects, and it's important in a lot of brain functions. And so if you start to get a shortage of this, then it's going to cause these dysfunctions. And the reason why you can't just replace it is because the chemical dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So early on, you can give somebody a drug called L-DOPA, and that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and the brain will convert it to dopamine. But unfortunately, the blood-brain barrier is adaptive and will prevent that from happening after a while. Okay, a stroke is a disruption of the blood supply to the brain, and how much damage is caused to the brain kind of depends on how many blood vessels are blocked by the stroke. So there are two major forms of it. Hemorrhagic is where arteries burst and leak blood into the brain, and ischemic is when you have a blockage. So you can either have arteries burst or you can have them get blocked. And what kind of symptoms that you suffer from the stroke depend on which area of the brain that gets affected and how large an area of the brain gets affected. Age and race, and to a certain extent gender, influence the likelihood of having a stroke. One of the final disorders that we're going to go through of the brain is prions, and these are infectious proteins. And so this is one of the weirdest things about biology, that you can have proteins that can actually get in. If they get into the brain, they'll cause other proteins to become prions. So they are if you think about the zombie apocalypse where zombies bite people and generate other zombies, prions would be kind of like the initial zombies. So they get into the brain and they affect other proteins in the brain, causing them to become infectious and spread things as well. So they'll replicate and accumulate in brain tissue. And some of the diseases are Kuru, Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which is the human version of mad cow disease. Um, and there's no treatment available at all for this because there's no way to stop these things once they get started. I mean, it's something that happens on the molecular level, and so once this starts, basically you're on the clock. There's no treatment available for it whatsoever, and they are invariably fatal. So we're going to talk about disorders of the spinal cord. Most of the time, spinal cord injuries are the result of some sort of physical trauma, and these keep impulses from traveling along neurons in the spinal cord. And a couple of things happen as a result of this. Sometimes the brain doesn't receive sensory information, and sometimes the brain can't send out motor information. It depends on the extent and the location of the spinal cord injury. So the problem with spinal cord injuries is something that I mentioned in a previous PowerPoint, and it's that Schwann cells can help with nerve regeneration in the peripheral nervous system, but in the central nervous system you don't have Schwann cells, you've got oligodendrocytes, and they don't bother to help out with nerve regeneration at all. So if you have an injury to the spinal cord, you can have paralysis of areas that are located below the site of the injury. And so if your injury is between T1 and L2, so the lowest thoracic vertebra and the highest lumbar vertebra, I'm sorry, between the lowest, let me start that over. An injury between the highest thoracic vertebra and the lowest lumbar vertebra can cause the lower body and legs to be paralyzed, and this is paraplegia. If you have an injury in the cervical region, at the neck region, it can affect the entire body, and this will be quadriplegia.